it's best to play along. My grandmother used to tell me that in every route outside the city limits, there exist people that live in the woods. Not the kind you'd see as hunters, campers, or any of that. These are the kind that didn't look right. She told me stories that tell me of these folk attempting to resemble or even disguise themselves as human beings. Tales of old that talk of neighbours or goodfellows, oftentimes the regular people encounter and soon reveal their true identities as being from beyond. I'd ask her why people would do such a thing. Couldn't we just let them live with us? She admitted that she was open to the idea, but she still kept a vigilant mindset, knowing that these people are not as friendly or understanding as we are. Not all of them are bad, she would say, but would they even know what we mean if we were to call them that? Like any other culture, many of them have their own unique terms and customs, with their own meanings behind certain things. What's bad to us may be enjoyable for them. But there was another thing she added whenever she would tell me a story. Sometimes it's best to play along. At first, I didn't know what she meant by that, but after a while, she did tell me that these folk of old would try to look human, but they would leave out a lot of obvious mistakes for us to notice, and once we did, it never ended well. So it was better to just move with whatever context you were working with before you noticed these differences. Your best bet was to end the conversation and just head home. After you reach your house, you'd be safe. Even so, she still advised to never go down that route again, at least not alone, because there is a chance you'd meet this stranger again if you do. She passed away not too long ago. She lived a lot longer than anyone would have guessed. Not a lot of old women get to 80 and still recognize their grandchildren's voices. It was hard seeing her go, but I knew there would be no escaping it. I moved to a different town after college, so I had to travel a bit by car to see her at the hospital, and soon, the cemetery. She could barely speak, but I was lucky enough to hear her call me by name one last time. And seeing the name Selina Gard on a tombstone made it harder for me not to shed a tear or two. I stayed in town for about a week and a half, spending time with my family and old friends, the nostalgia hitting me in the back of the head every time I met a familiar face. The thought of my grandmother never went away, despite the sense of contentment. Even with me living off somewhere else, I could tell knowing that she was gone would leave a lasting impact on me. Though it wasn't until I was back on the road that I remembered the stories she used to tell me. The afternoon sun started to descend, turning the once blue sky into a bright orange. I had just gotten out of the city, and it would take a while before I got back home. Oddly enough, the route I was taking was kind of like the ones Granny Celine was warning me about. Passing through a thicket of trees, a lot of them having straight and narrow roads that would soon lead to downward slopes of cliffs. I always loved hearing those stories from her. Sure, they were a little creepy when you really think about them, but they were fun to listen to, making me see another side of a magical thing I'd never seen before. I let out a sigh, feelings of longing and regret seeping out of me. The talk of magical shape-shifting beings in the forest isn't something you could just bring up to a coworker. Heck, I'd brought it up to some of my friends, and they either laughed or just admired me for remembering my grandmother's old tales. I knew they meant well, but I wish I knew a way to share them with others who'd really appreciate them the same way I did. I guess that's why I'm here right now, to share a piece of my grandmother's memory with you all, and how these stories had saved my life at that very moment. Another narrow road was up ahead, a long one this time around. The setting sun barely illuminated it through the canopy of trees. It looked like something you'd see in postcards. Out of nowhere, a siren began to wail. I checked my mirrors and soon saw the lights of a police cruiser behind me. I slowed down a little, letting him overtake the road to wherever he was going. I felt a cold sweat coming down as I realized he was still following me. Why? Why was he tailing me? As far as I knew, I hadn't really done anything wrong. Speed was good, lights were on, and I still used my turn signals, even with the lack of the other vehicles on the road. So why did it look like the law was trying to catch me in a crime? I began to slow down even further, soon coming to a complete halt. I breathed in and out, gripping the steering wheel tight. I never thought I'd find myself being pulled over by a cop, at least not in the middle of the woods. There was nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. There was going to be a reasonable explanation for this. The sun had almost vanished completely, nothing but the lights of both cars illuminating the road. Strangely though, as the officer stopped, I could see him turning the lights off first before heading out of his vehicle. But I didn't have time to think about it too much. I had the whole scenario planned out in my head. I was going to roll down the window, turn to the man or woman in uniform, and ask them what was wrong in a calm and orderly fashion. There was no room for error, and besides, I was no criminal. So why would I be so afraid? The police were there to help us after all. He knocked on my window, his tall frame only a silhouette from the tint of the glass, looking like a large man with broad shoulders staring down. Once again, I breathed in and out, repeating to myself that there was nothing wrong. I pulled down the windows and turned to my left, mustering up a smile. Evening off, only to be cut off by what I was seeing. Staring down at me was the officer, immediately noticing that large frame of this person that was not from his shoulders, but from the incredibly oversized head he had. "Howdy," he greeted, a tiny mouth moving like normal. I felt my stomach churn, just seeing it move along with the rest of the extra and barren skin on his face. "Fancy seeing a fellow like you out here tonight. Sorry to stop you here, out in the middle of nowhere. But protocol, you know. Otherwise, me and my family would be out here on the streets, taking scraps," he continued. Two large and beady blue eyes were locked with my own. I could see hints of a mustache growing just above his lip, barely visible from the large nose that sloped downward and forward. Tiny ears stood at either side of his head, as if part of the same theme his mouth was going for. It was hard to see, but I noticed a skinny stick of a neck from below his wide chin, the rest of his body being blocked by the door. The officer, this thing, looked as if he had been a disproportionate caricature of a man come to life. "Ah, what's the matter, son? Cat got your tongue?" he asked. "What?" I stammered. My throat went dry, fear consuming every fibre of my body that made everything feel numb. "I was just asking you where you were headed is all," he explained. I didn't even notice him asking that earlier. "Unless you're distracted by something." The tiny smile of his mouth grew wider, a new foreboding and manic look in his eyes, now glaring at me. Somehow, my grandmother's words had come back to me at that very moment. No, it's just, I've been going through something lately," I explained. "Ah, I see. What's gotten you so worked up?" he asked. Hearing him talk like an everyday normal human being felt wrong. His grotesque skin shifting uncontrollably as he formed different expressions that matched his facade of emotions. I wanted to leave, but from what Granny Celine had told me... It's nothing," I assured him, praying that this would kill the mood for him to keep talking. I don't want to bore you with the..." Suddenly, he leaned forward, his massive forehead barely fitting into the opening. "Ah, come on, son. Spit it out. It's better to have a good Samaritan listen to your problems every once in a while," he insisted, the whites of his eyes suddenly turning black, the irises dilating to an impossibly tiny shape. "So please, tell me all about it." His nose nearly touched the side of my own face, beads of sweat now dripping down to my neck. This was bad. Really, really bad. He had planned to drown out the conversation as long as possible, waiting for the moment that I would crack under the pressure, and lucky for him, things were indeed working in his favor. I had to end this before God knows what would happen to me. My grandmother passed away," I said bluntly. His tiny mouth drooped down, and so did his ears. "Oh, I see," he said. A brief moment of silence passed between us, a strange mixture of utter fear and empathy being injected into the scene. He did look sad, I'll give him that, But every time I turned to look at him, I felt myself getting closer and closer to shaking in my boots, and I absolutely did not want to let him see that. She had been hospitalized for quite some time now, and when I heard that she wasn't going to survive for too long, I began to tell him. He was still silent, as if motioning for me to finish the story. It had been so long since I saw her, and I couldn't understand why I hadn't even thought of going back. And when I was there, I could see how much she waited for her family to see her, and tears started to fall down now, a newfound feeling of sadness now blending in. This was not good. Even with the sad and mopey expression he had on his large face, I could see how eager he was to find me messing up. I wiped the tears away, trying desperately to make them stop. Something in my mind told me that he even noticed a hint of the fear in my movements. "Looks to me like your granny was a nice gal," the creature said, a tone of sincerity in his voice. I didn't look at him, fearing that he now had enough reason to take me to do whatever it was he had planned. "Sorry for being nosy, but what exactly happened to her?" Her body shut down. She'd been on life support for a while now. I wish I could have gotten to her sooner," I continued. Another long silence passed, with me stealing glances at the giant head of the monster in disguise. So far, I had been in the right direction. I should go," I blurted out, getting impatient. Thankfully, that didn't seem to give him the cue that I was desperately trying to leave. "Oh, yeah, right. But one last thing, though," he said to me. Without any warning, he leaned his head closer to me again, the whole car now shaking. "Son, you listen to me, and you listen good, because I'm only going to say this once. Got it?" I nodded frantically. I tried my best not to flinch. "Good. Because, son, your granny, she ain't ever mad at you. Not back then, and sure as hell not now. As long as you keep her in your heart and mind, she'll be happy thinking about you and whatever lies beyond this journey we call life. You got it?" I nodded again, more tears coming down. Now, don't get too sentimental. You need to keep your eyes on the road after all." "Right," I stated, feeling a sense of relief in knowing that I was able to steer the conversation to its end. "Okay, best be on your way then," he said. "You're all good here, partner, and remember what I said. Your granny loves you." He chuckled, his voice sounding as if someone had been deliberately changing the pitch willy-nilly. "Good night," he said, walking back to the vehicle behind me. I didn't dare to turn behind me, no matter how curious I was to see how he could fit his body into the car. I could only see an indistinct shadow getting inside, starting the car up, and then immediately taking off. He soon sped past the road and onto the dirt path of the forest itself, disappearing from sight. I rolled up my windows, making sure all my doors were locked. I started my own car and booked it out of there, not caring for any speeding limits I came across. I had to get home. That was the only way I would be rid of this nightmare. The rest of the night had been a blur. I can't exactly remember when I got back to civilization. The heavy feeling of being watched still stuck with me up until that point. Eventually I got home, locked everything up, and then tried to calm myself down. There were a few phone calls here and there, my family and friends talking to me. All I remember was the conversations we had were as awkward as the chat between me and that big-faced monstrosity. But it was enough to assure me that I was safe. Throughout the night, I couldn't stop thinking about my Granny Celine, but for very different reasons. It wasn't long before I realized that her stories did save my life, from a fate that even she didn't seem to know. Deep in my mind, I knew I just had to visit her again, to thank her in her own grave, but another part of me suggested that that isn't such a good idea. It's been over a year now. Nothing else happened similar to what occurred that night. My grandmother's death anniversary is coming up soon. Strangely, I feel like it'd be okay if I sit this one out, unless I could find some other route back to my old home. I think she wouldn't mind me missing one. After all, a cop did tell me that she'd still love me, no matter what.